Thank you, Friso. Thank you very much indeed. So we've heard our keynote speakers. They've talked about all the challenges we face: populism, exclusive nationalism, and the politics of fear. And we've heard about the role of the media and the responsibility of politicians. So now let's walk this talk. And we're going to do this with a panel discussion. It is going to be interactive. I'm sorry, Commissioner, you won't be here, but you're coming back later this afternoon. So we're looking forward to your participation. I'll be asking you some questions then as well. But now we have some very eminent policymakers in many, many different organizations, all of them working on human rights issues. And I'm going to ask them some key questions about how do we take this discussion forward? What are the actions that we can take to make our principles come to life? It's going to be interactive. I'll ask them a couple of questions, and then I'm going to open the floor to all of you to come and participate as well. So let me ask the panelists now to please come forward. From the European Parliament, we have Claude Moraes. Please, Claude, come forward. Chair of the Civil Liberties, Justice, Home Affairs Committee. From the Council of Europe, we have Christos Giakoumopoulos, Director General of Human Rights and Rule of Law. From the OHCHR, the UN's Human Rights Office, we have Peggy Hicks. Please come forward, Peggy, as well. From the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, we have Ingeborg Solrun Gísladóttir. And last but not least, we have Anna Rurka. She's president of the Council of Europe's Conference of INGOs and member of the Fundamental Rights Platform Advisory Panel. So I'm going to, as I said, rules of the game, very simple. I'm going to ask all of our panelists a few questions, and then I'm going to open the conversation to include all of you. And just wonderful, the sun is shining on me. So this is a very good omen. Let's start with you, Claude. So we've talked a lot about the politics of fear. And it seems to me that minorities are the core issue. People are worried about the other. And I was just wondering, Claude, you at the European Parliament, where are you taking this conversation? What are the actions that you envisage to tackle this challenge? You can.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Can you hear me okay?
Thomas, can we make sure that we hear Claude?
You can hear me now, yeah? No. Sorry.
Just a little technical hitch. Minor. Claude, what have you done? You've turned it all off.
Will I use one of those?
Yes, why don't you do that? Thank you. Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yes.
The old-fashioned ways are the best.
Sometimes.
Okay, so I was just thinking this is the normal time for the coffee break, but you've got me speaking. So if you're all still kind of awake, not that any of you were not awake, I'm going to answer the question, which is minority rights. First of all, to say that the people in this room, I very much agree with what the Commissioner said. It is people who have really spanned the last 20, I'm not saying you're old, but you've spanned the last 20, 25 years of fundamental rights work on minorities and anti-discrimination. And many of you have given your lives to this issue. So the answer to the question is that we have done very good work, first of all. And many of the things that have happened in the European Union are testament to this. But it's a paradox. We now face key challenges. So to put it into like a microcosm, we now have the extraordinary situation where you can feel at home. So yesterday, when I arrived at the airport, if you are an immigrant, I was born in India, I came to the European Union from India. So whenever you're in a taxi or you arrive in a place and somebody else is an immigrant or not white, you always say, what's it like in Vienna? So I met somebody, he's Pakistani, so I said, what's it like in Vienna? And he said, it's great, it's really good. So he felt good. He was going to get married, this is a long story. He was going to get married next week, but in some ways, anti-discrimination, integration is working. But last week I was in Poland, where the European Union is invoking Article 7 against the government. A few weeks ago, I was in Slovakia visiting the home of Jan Kuciak and his partner who had been executed, journalists who had been executed, as we heard. So a few weeks before that, I was in Libya, where they're emptying the detention camps, the worst detention, most brutal detention camps in the world, and some of those people are coming to the European Union. To answer your question, we are now in the most challenging of times, where we have to understand in this room that we have the tools to deal with anti-discrimination and human rights issues in the European Union, but we have to understand that we are in a very complex environment where implementation, applying the tools that we have, is now a very tough proposition. And we are doing it, I'm sorry to say, and I heard the Minister before, but I'm sorry to say, in a very tough political climate. And I think Michael said it in his speech. We have a very tough political climate in which to implement the tools in which we can attack discrimination and we can deal with human rights. But we have the tools, anti-discrimination law, and we have the baseline. But implementation now and dealing with fundamental rights breaches and anti-discrimination is now in the most tough environment because of the complexity and because of the unprecedented breadth of challenge.
That's right, Claude. I wanted to ask you, so the European Parliament did launch Article 7 proceedings against Hungary, right? So that was something that the Parliament did. What would you like more? You say the tools are there, they're not being used, the environment is challenging. What's your ideal vision of what the EU should be doing? Should there be a peer review mechanism, a little bit like we have for the Eurozone, you know, where you chastise countries that break fiscal barriers, etc.?
Well, I know people are very critical of the European Parliament. Sometimes they think the European Union, the Commission, exercises too much power. We found this in Poland last week. Perhaps the Hungarian government feel this is the case when the European Parliament voted a few days ago.
Yeah.
But we need to be smart. I think our speakers were right, and the Commissioner was right, and I think Michael was right when he said we need to be smart about human rights and anti-discrimination. We need to think ahead. The people in this room have done a lot of good work, but I also hear that we need to think ahead. How do we treat the future? And I think we need to understand that when you have Article 7, it's a sledgehammer. And this is the concern, that we also need to think about breaches that are happening where we need a much more nimble mechanism. And we're working on this. Having a fundamental rights mechanism which lies underneath Article 7, the sledgehammer, which applies to fundamental breaches which are happening before we get to Hungary, before we get to what is happening in Poland. We listen to civil society, we listen to organisations and oppositions and government so that we enforce what we call a European Union of values before this happens. And this is, of course, was proposed by our members of the European Parliament. I'm joined by many of them here, Sophie in 't Veld and others. We're proposing this.
Right.
So with your support, we need to do it because we need to work smarter on fundamental rights and anti-discrimination. And just to say this, Shada, and you know this because you championed it, to say that we have a race equality directive, and the guy I met at Vienna airport, the Pakistani guy, he's happy today, but if he goes for a job and he's discriminated against, I don't know, I mean, Austria is a great country, but I don't know how much it's implementing the Race Equality Directive.
Right.
It's not very well implemented around the European Union. So it's about implementation, and we need to be very smart about human rights because now we have all the tools, but let's be thinking about the mechanisms, no sledgehammers, but more subtle and clever mechanisms that all of us can get round and implement and enforce.
Absolutely. So as Michael said, let's channel our outrage. Thank you very much, Claude. Christos, you don't have to stand up. Not everyone has to stand up. But I'm going to ask you from the Council of Europe's point of view. So a lot was said about the responsibility of politicians, and there's an erosion of trust. I mean, there is a disconnect, a lack of confidence, a lack of trust with politicians among the general public. What are organizations like yours doing to try and combat that?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, say something? Start answering? Okay, go.
Is it okay?
No. Use this, yeah.
I'll take the microphone. The traditional way, as you put it. Yes, the Council of Europe is an intergovernmental organization. By the way, it gathers 47 member states, so much more than the European Union. And indeed, the question of threats, the lack of confidence, lack of trust of institutions is one of our major concerns. And the last annual report of our Secretary General, Torbjörn Jagland, actually referred precisely to the threats to institutions. As we see things, the lack of trust is linked to the lack of a feeling.
Can you hold it closer?
The vanishing feeling of belonging. And that is why this forum is extremely important. Because the feeling of belonging of people to the societies, to the values, to the institutions that have existed over 70 years in Europe and are the ones which have guaranteed peace and prosperity. The lack of trust is due probably, the increasing lack of trust, to the fact that some parts of our societies feel unprotected, left behind, discriminated. And you see that in the field of minorities, people who have faced abuse from state authorities, impunity, people who have faced crimes, who have remained unprotected. Not only unprotected in their everyday life, but I would say also in the field of social justice. The increasing social injustice that we are facing today is certainly an important matter of an important element of the leading to lack of trust. So you asked what the Council of Europe is doing. The Council of Europe is actually an intergovernmental organization, as I said. Its objective is to gather member states, its member states together, provide for a common understanding of the problem, common standards, monitor the implementation of these standards,
Right.
and provide assistance to those member states which are unable, sometimes unwilling, to reach the level of protection that is required.
Right.
We talked about human rights. There is no trust to institutions if you don't have human rights, and this is where our interests actually with the Agency for Fundamental Rights absolutely coincide, but also there are other aspects which are linked to human rights, democracy, the rule of law, because as you very well know, there is no possibility to have human rights without democracy and rule of law. So we work on this basis.
Right.
Justice, if I may just one more word, justice, access to justice, to independent, fair, impartial, transparent, and efficient justice is the key issue and the key response to the issue of lack of trust.
So Christos, it's all based on incentives, it's all based on encouragement and openness, but you don't have any peer, it's all based on peer pressure. What about being actually sanctions or taking action or naming and shaming? Do you think it's time now in this very challenging environment to move a step forward, become more proactive about these things?
I don't think that we are only encouraging, unless you mean that in the whole international environment, the only way is to encourage, which may be true. We have a court, the European Court of Human Rights, which takes binding judgments and can find violations. We have a number of monitoring bodies against torture, concerning corruption, concerning money laundering, concerning discrimination and racism, including trafficking of human beings, violence against women. And these bodies identify very clearly where are the shortcomings in the implementation of the standards. By the way, the European Union uses them very extensively, and I would say even in the process of Article 7 concerning Hungary, most of the findings on which the Article 7 procedure is based relate to findings of Council of Europe bodies, the Venice Commission, the Committee for the Efficiency of Justice, the Consultative Council of Judges, etc.
So working in tandem is the way forward. You're absolutely right. Thank you very much, Christos. So Peggy, so the United Nations General Assembly is meeting even as we speak. We have the UNGA meeting in New York. And from your point of view, from the UN point of view, what do you see as the main challenges in Europe? We've heard a lot about the challenges from the European side, from the UN's point of view, and beyond. I mean, we're just not having problems within Europe. We face a world which has sort of gone off track in a sense.
Thanks very much. Hey, mine's working. Very good. Good first sign. I have to say, sitting here in Europe, what I've heard already about the challenges is pretty much what I wanted to tell you, Shada. I mean, we're concerned, of course, at the UN level about a rising tide of populism, of hatred, of xenophobia, of discrimination, of anti-migrant sentiment, and its impact on the world that we live in, this divisive nature of attacks, and particularly on protection of what we call civic space, the ability of all of us to engage with our governments in a way that allows us to influence policy and to be part of these conversations successfully, and on a very, I think, almost shocking situation in Europe where we thought that the institutions of rule of law, of protection of civic space were solid and were impenetrable to some extent, seeing real challenges in that space. So rather than go into more depth on those challenges, I wanted to maybe put on the table a couple of the ways, reflecting on the comments made earlier, we're looking at some of the steps that might be taken to address those. With regards to the protection of civic space, I think this goes exactly to Claude's point about the need to have things that go below the level of Article 7 and to make them more effective. At a minimum, if you want to protect something, you have to have quality information on what's happening, monitoring, reporting, and making that part of the public record. Obviously, the Fundamental Rights Agency has taken a very important step in terms of the reporting that they've done on civil society space, but that's a one-off. We need to make that part of what FRA does on a routine basis, make it part of what every European institution is responsible for in a different way, and bring that into the other conversations, to the multi-annual financial framework post-2020, and the discussions that we're having there about conditionality of rule of law, for example, as well.
Just a quick follow-up, Peggy. So, you know, the European Union does stand at the pulpit, right, and has a certain kind of moral authority across the world where it talks about the Rohingya crisis or the Palestinians or whatever. Do you think that what's happening in Europe today in terms of attacks on minorities, populism, is that eroding Europe's influence abroad?
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm very glad you've asked the question. One of the key things that we see is that in a world in which multilateralism is under attack, the European Union is all the more important in terms of the values that it sets and ways that it takes up these key challenges that we're talking about. We've heard a lot today already about the challenge and the opportunities posed by technology for human rights. Those are, in my view, some of the critical issues when we look at which direction we're going to go with human rights in the next decade. Will we continue on a path to progress in human rights, or will we slip back? Will we see real challenges going forward? And when we look at how states like Germany have reached out and tried to regulate the space, for example, in the Net ZG law, we see some models that could be followed elsewhere in the world that are quite dangerous in terms of balancing the restriction of free speech with the need for online content to be regulated, for example. So Europe should know that the eyes of the world are on it, that they will follow and adapt and use the models that are set here, but in many cases without the same level of protection for human rights. So it's all the more imperative that Europe gets these tough questions right, and that it brings real nuance to those conversations. I wanted to also comment, though, on the need for us to bring people along with us. the absolute importance of building a true global constituency for human rights. Too often these discussions have been held at this macro level without really talking about what people are concerned about, how security is actually not challenged by human rights, but how human rights are a fundamental tool for security. But the problem is, and the earlier speakers addressed this, the reality we've seen is that the amount of investment and time that's going in to building the narrative about the threat of human rights, the threats of security, is not matched by what we invest in trying to build stronger, better societies and in human rights. And again, I'd mention an idea that I believe Claude has been behind of the Values Fund that the Commission is now looking at, and the need to make that investment in these issues, in human rights, much stronger. And I think it needs to go beyond just pulling things together, but we need to really recognize that if we want to build stronger, more rights-respecting societies, there has to be a commensurate level of investment that allows grassroots organizations to be effective as well.
Absolutely. I'll come back to Claude later, but I just want to pursue the conversation for your region, Ingeborg. So the OSCE region, what do you see as the main challenge, and how are you tackling them?
Yeah, I can hear my microphone is also working, so...
It's the guys.
Let me just start by saying, because I've been sitting here, and I must tell you, and I must thank the FRA for this opening session here, because I really got inspired, both by listening to the music and also listening to Michael. And it's not often that you get inspired these days, when you're sitting in meetings. But this was really... and this awakened somehow the old activist in me, that I thought, why don't we just go out and be the change we want to see? Why, I want to be this agent of change. I want to be an activist. And when you feel like this, you have to allow yourself to get emotionally involved in working on human rights. Thanks a lot for this. And because we sometimes tend to get lost in some bureaucratic processes and projects and thinking, instead of thinking about the society out there, how can we really support the people on the ground that are working on human rights on a daily basis? It can be both in governments, government institutions, but I think, civil society is really key here, and all kinds of grassroots movements and the human rights defenders. This is the people we really need to support in their work. And this is also what we are seeing in most of the countries of the OSCE, is that the space for civil society is shrinking. It's getting more and more difficult for them to work. Financially, it's getting more difficult, but also just to be active. And human rights defenders are also victims of hate crimes, and that's what we are seeing in increased numbers. And that's one of the things that we really need to think about, is the hate crimes, the hate speech and the hate crimes. And this is a very concerning increase in hate crimes that we are seeing in all parts of the region. OSCE was very much in the beginning. It was established in the optimistic 90s. And then the countries that were members of OSCE, they were very optimistic, and they were thinking about the liberal democratic values, and they made political commitments to uphold these values. But since then, things have been going maybe on a bit of a slippery slope. But nonetheless, we need to, and OD's role is to keep them, hold them to account to these commitments that they gave in the 90s. They are still members of the club. They still have made these commitments, and they have to uphold them. We can support them in doing that, but we can also support civil society in holding governments to account and supporting governments.
Thank you very much. So is this? Yeah, it's on. So thank you very much, Ingeborg. We'll come back with some comments and questions to what you've said. You talked about civic space, and that's why I'm going to turn to Anna Rurka now, because that is why you're here, what you represent. And your challenges, we've heard from everyone, it's not just the media that is enemies of the people, but civic society activists, human rights defenders are also seen as as enemies of the people. And it's contagious, right? What happens in Europe doesn't stay in Europe, or America for that matter. Your views?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, the human rights defenders can also be seen as the enemy of the government. It depends on which place on which seat we see. But what I would like to mention is that today, it is good to have the positive approach. We know that we have the standards, but we have the problem with implementation of the standards. When I go to the member states, I saw the really very great laws, but they are not implemented. So this is the question about the accountability. And after then, we have this phenomenon which we call shrinking civic space, which is, for me, just the abuse of fundamental rights of freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, rights to information, etc., which is really very multi-level problem, because there is the problem of the law, but also the practices. And for that, we need really very concrete solution. That's why all international institutions which are represented here are really expected. There is the fourth expectation from the civil society side to give the concrete solution to concrete problem. I can give you some examples.
Just give us concrete solutions.
Yeah, concrete
Give us
example.
one. Yeah.
For example, smaller NGOs in the member states, they don't have the chance to have the funding. The NGOs I speak about Poland because I speak with the Polish NGOs. They don't have the funding to go to the court, to try to just, have the access to rights. So we need the funding for politicization. We need also to support the NGOs, smaller NGOs in the member states. We need support the independent NGOs, because today we have also this phenomenon when the government set up their own NGOs, what we say governmental-oriented NGOs. And how we make we can really very easily make the difference between them, but you need to have the insight in the situation. As the international institution, when you go there, the government will say, okay, we have the NGOs in the public consultation, but what we know, who is on the table.
Right.
And I would like to also raise, because we speak about the trust, we speak about the belonging. I think that today the big stake is the question of citizen participation in the decision making. The people don't really feel heard by the politicians, and democratic institutions are disconnected from the grassroots.
How do you change that, Anna? How do you get citizens' participation?
We need
Very quickly.
We need very quickly. We need the banding on state instrument to oblige the public institution to conduct objective and transparent consultation, public consultation on lawmaking process, on different other kind of decision that the public institution are obliged to take.
So more effective consultations. Okay.
Effective and really binding one.
Binding consultation. Thomas, could we have the questions from Debating Europe? I'm going to come to you, Claude. No one's turning back. So we asked a community of citizens for their comments on what was the major challenges on human rights in EU countries. And let me just read them very quickly, because some of you may not be able to see it. So Boris, human rights without jobs and decent salaries are nothing. Valeria said, human rights are under threat because of austerity. Catherine said, human rights are the idea of a globalist elite. Ivan said, why does the left place rights above responsibilities? These are what citizens are thinking and saying. And Tomasz said, Europe seems increasingly fractured and disunited. Do you think its citizens and government will continue to have shared principles and speak with one voice? Claude, your response.
Yeah, I was just about to put this on. Can you hear me?
No.
You can hear me now, yeah? Can you hear me? some conspiracy to silence the European Parliament. This meeting is going on longer than a European Parliament meeting, and I'm so pleased some of you are getting coffee. These comments are exactly what I wanted to say, because when I began like showing my age and a traditional sort of human rights, anti-discrimination narrative, which is about the victims. I mean, I guess I was a victim, I was an immigrant, my family suffered discrimination when we arrived in Europe, in the European Union. But the point is that we're going into a very new populist phase, which I mentioned at the end of what I was saying, which is unprecedented, which is an inversion of the traditional way that we are dealing with the whole issue of minority rights and human rights. And just put very simply, migration will break the back of the European Union, and it will break the back of our concept of how we implement fundamental rights and human rights. There is nothing like migration to damage this very positive work. And people always underestimate the impact of migration and immigration, but this is the number one issue. It is always the number one issue. And if I give you one example, at the moment, the crossings in the Mediterranean are going down very sharply, but the issue is just going up very sharply. And it will continue to go up sharply because the fear of migration is now outstripping any idea of the numbers, and the aftermath of the relative impact in countries like this and Germany and Sweden and so on is going to last for a long time, because unscrupulous politicians are going to ensure that it does, and the media is going to ensure that it does, and we heard about that.
Yeah.
And technology is going to ensure that it does.
Right.
But this is the most important point. So the way that we deal with anti-discrimination and fundamental rights is that we will have to manage migration, we will have to communicate that to people, because what happened to me in Poland last week when we were discussing fundamental rights in a country with the least amount of migration in the European Union was migration was raised. And discussing human rights when migration is being raised is a real issue. And I think this is the big challenge that we have right now, and it's the challenge that many of you have in the jobs that you're doing and understanding how we get through this, because we cannot sacrifice fundamental rights and human rights work. It's the defining thing for the European Union. I'll just give one final example. The European Union's reputation, which you mentioned, Shada, European values are not just European Union values. They're important to the European Union, but they're global values. But we are being damaged at the moment because people see that the European Union has to have a set of values. And that's being damaged at the moment because people see a standard that is going down. So we resettle very few people now because refugees, because we feel we're full up in some countries. And that's what's happening now in the United States. So we have to think clearly what reputation we want if we start on disembarkation centres or control centres, or do we think in a fresh way about managing migration and having a settlement on fundamental rights and human rights. You talked about the values programme, you talked about working smart, as Michael was talking, but we really have to think really carefully, because this issue has the potential to wipe out many thoughts.
All the gains we've made.
And here, the quotes here
Claude, I'll have to
are about
actually
inverting the work that we do, and I think that is the danger that we face.
Absolutely, and you've absolutely taken the bull by the horns and said what is essential, that migration numbers are down, hysteria is up. And that is a big challenge for all of us. I'll come back to all of you, but I promise interactive, and I'll try and deliver on interactive. So Friso, have any questions been coming in, say, on Twitter? Otherwise, can I ask anyone from our participants? You're not the audience, you're actually stakeholders and part of the discussion. If you have any specific questions, please put up your hand. Yes, I see. Yeah.
And if you can
Please,
shortly
I'd also
introduce
like
yourself.
some women to ask a question, please. So please, otherwise I'll pick on you. Please, sir.
Hi, I have two questions.
Can you identify yourself?
Okay, sorry.
please?
Sorry, one question, please.
No, yeah, exactly. Only one
Sorry.
question
Okay.
and a very brief question.
Yeah, all right. Alex from Malta. I'm an anti-corruption activist. And the question is, how do we keep trolls from censoring what we say? We have an issue where we post, we discuss, we post blogs, and then they're censored on social media. They're shut down, they're closed down by reports saying that it's spam or it's hate speech or any other reason for spam. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Do I see another hand going up? Yes, thank you. Short question, please introduce yourself.
Hello, good morning. My name is Daniela Pitschler and I'm the Policy and Campaigns Director of the European Women's Lobby. And thank you for mentioning that women should also be able to ask questions. My question would be, and that's a very important issue for us at the moment, how the different organizations are responding to the challenge of intersectionality. Women, but also men, children, girls and boys facing intersecting forms of discrimination, because we believe that the human and women's rights of people that are facing multiple forms of discrimination are the ones that are most threatened at the moment through the global backlash against humans and women's rights. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So with those two questions and the questions that we have from Debating Europe, I'm going to turn back to the panelists, and I'm going to ask Christos if you would like to come in at this point. Christos, just check to see if you...
Does it work now? It still doesn't. So I will continue with this one. The two questions by Boris and Valeria actually are quite indicative of the situation we face today. I talked about social injustice and about the need to protect social rights, because this is what Boris and Valeria ask actually. And what Catherine says about human rights being an idea of a globalist elite is the perception that one gets if jobs and decent salaries are not existing. I think that our organizations, nonetheless, after several years of insisting on, probably rightly so, insisting on civil and political rights, have ultimately decided to pay some attention to social rights. The initiative of the European Commission about the pillar of social rights is absolutely positive. But I would like also to say that in this framework and in the framework of the credibility that the institutions, in particular international institutions like the European Union, need to have, a commitment to international obligations is absolutely important. Commissioner Jourova talked about the Istanbul Convention some time ago. I think that it is also important to think about the accession of the European Union to the European Convention of Human Rights, because this would be a significant step, which, by the way, is not an issue of wish or an option. It is an obligation deriving directly from the EU treaties. And I would say that perhaps it is high time to consider accession of the European Union to the European Social Charter, which is also a wish that has been repeatedly expressed by the European Parliament. I think that these moves would clearly show the commitment of the European Union to human rights. Now let me come to the two questions that you have asked about. How do you come about censorship? I think that there are many ways about that. Domestic courts are, of course, the main protector of freedom of expression. The Council of Europe has a platform on which you can complain about, journalists can complain about being under threat or being excessively under censorship or under extreme restrictions. And ultimately, of course, the way is to complain to the European Court of Human Rights. Unfortunately, there is no other way of protecting rights when the domestic authorities are not, do not live up to their obligations.
Thank you, Christos. I think that is a very important point that you've made about agency, that we all have agency and we all have to take our responsibilities as well. Peggy, if I could ask all of you now to be quite concise, because we've been here for a very long time and I think people are getting a bit restless
Thanks. I can't leave Claude's points about migration uncommented on, though, and I think it's really important for that subject to be on the table. But I also want to emphasize that what I said earlier comes back to this as well. The reality is, yes, there are issues with migration that have to be addressed, but as all the speakers have pointed out, the fear and the lack of solid information actually drives anti-migrant sentiment. It's obviously the case, and we've seen in so many polls, that the people that are most opposed to migration, as Claude said, are those that are sometimes the furthest away from it, have the least information and least evidentiary basis for what they believe. So that is where actually investing in really telling the stories of how migrants contribute to societies, talking about what it means not to have a society that is diverse and the disadvantages from an economic standpoint, from a diversity standpoint, from a cultural standpoint.
Do you think no one's doing that, Peggy?
The investment in that is minuscule compared to the investment that goes into using this information in the other way. We need to invest in it. We need to do it better. Europe also has to recognize, though, that if it wants to solve the migration problem, it cannot do it simply within Europe.
Sure.
It also has its global role. And that doesn't mean just putting up bigger and better barriers. It means actually being willing to invest in the countries and problems which are driving much migration today. And unfortunately, what we've seen is at the same time this anti-migrant sentiment has come up, we've seen disinvestment rather than increased investment in addressing the problems that are driving migration.
To be fair, though, I mean, we are at the European level thinking of new partnerships with Africa. We are thinking of also doing something on the global stage, global compacts, etc. So there is a brighter side, if I may, to the conversation. It's not just dark and gloomy, but you're absolutely right, Peggy, to focus on Europe's responsibilities. Ingeborg, please.
Yeah, no, can I just wanted to, can you hear me? Yeah. I just wanted to reply to the question on intersectionality of discrimination, because, and I want to take Roma as a sample, because ODIHR has a clear mandate to work on Roma and Sinti. I think it's the only regional organization that has a clear mandate to do so. And to tell you the truth, it's not easy. And specifically, I want to mention here Roma women, because I think they experience in their everyday life, you know, this intersectionality of discrimination, be it economic discrimination, racial discrimination, sexual discrimination. And the thing is, when it comes to this hierarchy of discriminations, it seems that the Roma population in Europe is, in a way, on the bottom. And there seems to be very few states and very few politicians that think they have anything to gain from engaging actively in trying to work against this discrimination of Roma people. But that's where we want to focus on, especially Roma women and Roma youth. See how we can activate them and make them the agents of change.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. And these are some of the issues that will be discussed during the three days in different sessions and obviously also in plenary. So thank you for that, Ingeborg. Anna, please.
Yes, maybe I would like to react on questions sent by Katerina and Tomasz. Human rights are the idea. No, they are not idea. This is not the principle, this is the rights. And this is one of the big progress of civilization through the European Convention on Human Rights, which transpose the principle to the rights. So this is an important thing. And yes, I think that one day, and we still are in this situation, that we can be on the same table with the government and we can have the important contradictory dialogue. We are not obliged to agree, but let's talk. And it is so important to maintain the dialogue about the shrinking civic space, about the human rights, about the new threat and new abuse, which really the new abuse really need to have the new solution and new tools. I think about, for example, the regulation of the money laundering, which now are used against human rights NGOs. Because over-interpreted by the government, or Schengen regulation, which serve to other member states to just make explosion of the activists. So we should really speak about together and looking for the common solution.
Thank you very much indeed. Claude, I really have to take this conversation forward. Okay, go ahead, quick. It's okay. All right.
The guy on trolling, can you hear me?
Yes, can you pick up the microphone, Claude? Very quickly.
Yeah, the
please.
guy on trolling,
Yes, trolling,
about
yes.
online, because you're all using it. Media and social media and technology is going to be critical to the human rights offer. And what's coming from the Commission, to be honest, is the new proposal on illegal content online, which is really coming from the security side. What Commissioner Jourova talked about was code of practice, which is good, but it's really discussions with industry. I think we need something a bit more comprehensive, and that's something I think here the NGOs, civil society, a lot of the experts in this room need to be thinking about in terms of how you promote human rights and some of the values that we're thinking about here, because this guy was talking about promoting certain messages and so on, but not being able to get them out. And that's a journalistic problem as well. And that's not being handled at the moment in the European Union. So I just wanted to mention that point. And on intersectionality, the Parliament put that on its agenda, just to mention, but the political climate is not good for progressing these issues at the moment, including the horizontal directive.
Okay, thank you very much.
One sentence just to
Yes.
flag that at the UN level, the Secretary General has put together a new strategy on technology, and one of the pieces is specifically looking at some of these issues where we need to look at that intermediate step, as Claude said, between the current voluntary system of codes of practices and regulation, and looking, for example, at ideas like media councils that would have a binding nature within an industry as well. So looking at other models that can actually bring some real answers to questions like the trolling question that was raised.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much indeed for that clarification. So, as we've seen, a lot of work in progress, a lot of ideas out there, but we also face very, very many challenges, political, but also in terms of implementation. If there's one thing I've learned from this panel, it's so important to actually walk at this talk. So with that, please join me in thanking our panelists. And I'm giving the floor now to Friso again.